All right, very good. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. This is our last program of what we think has been a very productive ILOC conference. I love Sam's description of this. She has called this year's ILOC conference of 2025, she has called this the year that ILOC can vote. Because we've been doing this now for 18 years, believe that or not. We're glad to have you here. If you've been here throughout the day, we're super glad to have you here tonight. And all of you who are library board members, welcome. I'm Bonnie McEwen with the Northwest District Office. And tonight's program is called Evaluating Your Library's Value Beyond Cost Benefit Analysis. Now, that's a method of evaluation that looks at the financial benefits of shared resources versus the cost of running the library. And while this kind of analysis is valid, it's important. We all know that libraries add value in many other ways that can be hard to quantify. So, to help us learn more about this is our speaker tonight, Kevin Unrath. Kevin is the consultant for library operations with the Vermont Department of Libraries, helping managers, trustees, and friends groups enhance library service. He has worked in library administration for 25 years, including serving as the director of two pretty busy libraries. His master's in library science degree comes from the University of Illinois. So we're so very glad to have you join us tonight. Kevin, thanks for being here.
Well, thank you. I'm so glad to be here. And can you hear me okay, Bonnie?
Yes, I can.
Wonderful. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so you can see my slides. I did want to say, as I'm sharing, thank you for the kind introduction. And thanks to Sam for the invitation and to the State Library of Iowa also for inviting me here to give this presentation. Before I get started with the slides, I wanted to show you I tried to find the most Iowa appropriate mug I could find. This is from our local Harvest Festival here in Jericho, Vermont, but I felt like it sort of had the John Deere colors.
The cut, well, it's kind of like Iowa Hawkeye colors, it looks like to
Thank
me.
you. Even better, even better.
There you go.
That's the closest connection I could find, other than the fact that it is also very cold here in Vermont, and we have a bunch of relatively small libraries that are typically independently managed, a lot like Iowa does. So we have
Yes.
a lot of similarities there, I think. Um, so let's go ahead and get started. You've heard my bio. I'm not going to go over that again, so thank you for that. But I do want to talk about what our goal is here today. And I made a very simple goal. You all have been attending ILOC, some of you for the whole day, so I don't want to make it too difficult. My goal here is to leave you with at least one new way to think about the value of your library. That's the overall goal. If you leave with one, that's great. If you leave with more than one, even better. I hope to leave some time at the end of the presentation for questions. If not, I'll make sure that you have my email available for questions. All right. So I'm starting today's presentation with a library that's very local to where I work. This is the Aldrich Library in Barre, Vermont. It's literally right down the hill from where the Department of Libraries offices are. This photo is from Kenneth Zirkle. It was taken in 2021, summertime, obviously. And by national standards, this is a pretty small library, but in Vermont, this is actually a library in the top 5% in terms of square footage. It's about 20,000 square feet. In terms of population served, it's about 16,000 residents. I think that'd be a size F library in your Iowa statistical categories. I want to focus on some of the details, though, that are in this picture as a way to introduce the topic of how to value your library and going beyond just that cost-benefit analysis that Bonnie talked about. And so if you see close up in this picture, you can see, I'll go back. You can see Mr. Pickwick on the left-hand side and then a banner over the door on the right. So the Mr. Pickwick statue is a statue that's a representation of the main character of Charles Dickens' novel. It was carved by a local sculptor, Giuliano Cecchinelli. He's known as the last Italian stone carver in Bari, which is a town that has a lot of granite quarries. And I have a quote that I pulled from Mr. Pickwick from Dickens' novels. This is what he says about some students of his. They are fine fellows, very fine fellows, with judgments matured by observation and reflection, and tastes refined by reading and study. I am very glad of it. So for me, this statue represents the library at its most traditional form as an institution of learning, and rightly so. And in contrast to that, you'll see the banner above the door, which says free food for kids and teens this summer. So the library in Barrie, as well as some other libraries around the state, partner with an organization called Hunger Free Vermont. And this banner for me in the same picture illustrates what the library is as a community builder. So this past summer, I walked by the library. I saw some teens and tweens actually participating in this program out in front of the library, and there was a stand set up for them to shop for gently used clothes, and another table was set up for community volunteer opportunities. It was just a wonderful representation of a library as a community builder. So we have two very distinct ideas to start out with. A library can be an institution of learning, it can be a builder of communities. And it's possible that only the first was really thought of when this library was built in the early 1900s, but certainly the second isn't any less important. And it's great that they can be found at the same institution, at the public library. And I want to go a little further than this. So if you go to the Aldrich's website, you'll find this webpage, Oral Histories of Barrie. I'm going to read a quote that's at the top of the page. It's probably so small you can't read it, but I will read it to you here. Your local history has been uncovered. Tucked away in our storage room, we had recorded audio tapes that featured approximately 100 interviews conducted by Andrew Sakar from April 1976 to August 1977 for the Aldrich Public Library. Up until now, you either needed a reel-to-reel tape deck or audio cassette player in order to listen to them. One of the blessings of the library closing for COVID-19 was having the time to digitize all these oral histories so that our local history can be preserved for all to hear. And interestingly, among the dozens of recordings that have been digitized, there was one from a much younger Giuliano Cecchinelli, recorded in 1977. So that sculpture that you saw in front of the library, same sculptor, and he sculpted that in, I think, 2005. But this was a oral history or recording of the same sculptor in 1977. And I'm going to play just a little bit of it for you. I hope you'll be able to hear it.
Sculpture.
And I would like first for you to tell me where you were born and a little bit about your family.
Okay, I was born in Carrara, Italy. I mean, October 19, 1943.
You said that your father also...
Yeah, my father was a stonecutter.
All right. So it's a pretty amazing coincidence that the library not only has a sculpture from the last Italian stonecutter in Barrie, but also happens to have a recording of the oral history of him from 20, 30 years, 40 years really earlier than today. So I point this out because this is another value that I think it's important for us to think about when it comes to public libraries, and that's public libraries as keepers of history, typically along with local historical societies. We keep the town's history. And then I have one more value I'd like to jump back to that first picture that I showed you to talk about. So here's that photo again. You can see the sculpture, you can see the banner. I played the oral history for you, and I want to talk a little bit about the building itself. So this is obviously it's a brick building. It's finished with local Barrie granite, and it's served the community since 1907, so more than 100 years. I want you to think about how many people have been able to come inside and get out of the heat of the summer or the cold of the winter, and we have a lot of that here in Vermont. How many tens of thousands of residents have borrowed books here instead of buying them? How many utilize that living room of the community that a library is when their living situation at home might have been a cramped boarding house. And actually, that's typical housing in Barrie for workers up until the post-war, the latter half of the 20th century. We had a lot of boarding houses for people working in the quarries. So the library is one lasting structure that all are able to share with books and other materials in the center of the city. It's not only a cost savings, but it's a significant environmental savings to have this collective resource sharing. I like to say that libraries were green and were part of the sharing economy 100 years before that was cool. So the fourth value that we're going to focus on today is the library as a sustainable resource sharer. All right, before we get into those in more detail, I want to tell a couple of stories about why it's important to value your library. So about 15 years ago, I was the manager of circulation and branches at the Middletown Township Library System. And one of probably the lowest point in my career was when the board there decided to close the three branch libraries. They just kept the main library, but due to budgetary issues, they voted on February 20th to close three branch libraries, including one that had been in existence longer than the main library. And those closures happened on March 1st. So I don't need to tell you that happening in places all over the country, economic, sometimes legal leverage is being used to challenge the longstanding tradition of libraries serving everyone. So having an inventory of your library's values allows you to defend it when it's challenged. That's one reason I think it's really important. And then I'm going to switch over to a bit of a higher point. About 7 years later, I relocated, moved here to Vermont, and I was the director of the public library in Shelburne, Vermont, and we were able to advocate for a larger library. And this is a picture of us opening the doors to that new library. It's a $7 million project. It required an enormous amount of advocacy and dozens of community meetings. And knowing what the various values were of the library allowed us to go out and speak with a strong and unified voice as a board, and me as a library director and other folks in the town, in order to be able to talk about those things that the library brought to the community. So advocacy isn't just to defend the library when it's under attack, but it's also to move the library forward when you need to perhaps ask for something like capital funds. Before I move on to talk about those four areas, institutions of learning, community builders, keepers of history, sustainable resource sharers, I want to talk about cost-benefit analysis a little bit more, just to talk about why that isn't the focus here. And I'm going to call this the show me the money approach, or the monetary value of services. And a very basic example of this, probably the most basic, you may have seen on a library's Facebook, some of you may have this, the checkout receipts that list the amount of money someone has saved. And I just have to read you this one from Mesa Public Library because I love it. This is out of Mesa, Arizona. And the caption says, "If you know Karen, you know she reads a lot of books. So many books that she has saved $65,550.33 since she began using her Mesa Public Library card in 2010. Next time you visit, take a look at your checkout receipt to see how much money you've saved by using the library. It all adds up." And I think this is a great way to show the value of a core library offering to your library patrons. Not a bad idea. And then just above and to the right, you'll see the little box that says "I love libraries." That's an example of an online library value calculator. That one happens to be from the American Library Association. So these library value calculators that you may have seen, they don't just quantify the materials checked out, but they'll also quantify program attendance, computer use, reference assistance, using an average cost of the material or the service. And when you type these in, either your own personal use of the library, or you can take the library's annual statistics and plug those in, you can kind of get a rudimentary return on investment for what you're getting out of the library. I did this once actually for the public library that I managed, and we calculated that our ROI was 3.16. So for every one tax dollar we spent, we provided the public with $3.16 of benefits, and it was a good statistic. I think I put it in the annual report. And these are two very basic, simple examples of cost-benefit analysis. But actually, there's whole books written on the topic of cost-benefit analysis in libraries. The standard in the field is Measuring Your Library's Value, how to do a cost-benefit analysis for your public library. If it's something you're interested in, not a bad book to check out. The idea of cost-benefit analysis is that you identify, you quantify, and you communicate the library's value in dollars. And the authors of this book, which I've read, have very detailed guidance on how to do so. But they also have a few caveats. I love this quote from William Cameron: "Not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted." So there are significant limitations that the authors actually identify themselves in cost-benefit analysis. So first of all, it only measures direct but not indirect benefits. An example of an indirect benefit is if someone becomes literate using the library's collection, they learn to read as a child using the library's books. Society is going to benefit from someone being educated who can vote, work, give back to their community, and pass that literacy along to the next generation. And that's a hard benefit to measure. There's also such a thing as non-use benefits. And that means even if a person isn't coming into the library, they may still value the library. And that could be because they may plan to use it someday, even though they're not using it today. That's called an option value. Another reason is that they may value the existence of the library in the community as an educational and social institution. So many people who donate to the library actually aren't users of the library, especially those who donate large amounts of money for a capital campaign. They don't necessarily need the services the library offers, but they value having it in the community, just like they value having a school or a hospital. And finally, intangible benefits. So things you can't quantify, like being able to access correct and timely information, and as a fundamental benefit, as a fundamental requirement of being in a healthy democracy. There's no real way to quantify that. And so the authors of the book on cost-benefit analysis talk about this. They say they only measure some of the benefits, so their analysis intentionally underestimates the overall benefit. They're very conservative in their calculations of cost-benefit analysis. So that's just a long way of saying it's great to use saved receipts. It's good to use a library value calculator. It's not bad to do a detailed cost-benefit analysis. But I would argue that right now we need to think a little bit more outside of the box and not be too purposefully conservative. I think we need to be assertive and maybe even a little aggressive in bringing our message in order to show the passion we bring with us. We need to, when someone either questions the value of the library at a public meeting, or you may be at a cocktail or a Christmas party and someone says, "Why do we need a library when we have the internet?" I think it's good to have some ammunition to respond to that isn't just, well, you get $2 of benefit for every $1 you spend. And so that's what I'm here to try to talk about and elucidate a little bit more. All right, just to go over again those 4 areas that I'm focused on. The library as an educational institution or an institution of learning, as a community builder, as a keeper of history, and a sustainable resource sharer. Excuse me. So our goal today is for you to be able to leave with at least one new idea you didn't have before. So let's jump into some detailed analysis of these 3. First of all, institution of learning. And I have a value statement associated with each of these areas of value. And the value statement for the library as an institution of learning is: libraries add value as institutions of learning by providing literacy and educational resources. So public libraries, since their founding, have been institutions of knowledge and learning. Beyond their role in lending material, they serve as institutions of formal education. They support lifelong learning through workshops, lectures, programs. From early literacy programs for children to continuing education opportunities for adults, libraries foster a culture of learning that enriches individuals and enhances community knowledge capital. And I have a few examples, some of which are measurable and some of which are more qualitative, that I think fit in this category. The first is the circulation of materials. This is a core function of libraries. I'm going to jump ahead a slide and then jump back just to show you what I think is a great example of an illustration of that, and that's Idaho's circulation. On the left, you'll see a quick facts about Idaho's public library, or an infographic, and you'll see, I think this is actually from 2 fiscal years ago, that their physical circulation was 11,629,000, as well as their electronic circulation, almost 3 million. That's a classic measure of how you'd show what the library is providing in terms of learning for the community. Another measure could be computer usage. And again, if you look at Iowa, 768,000 uses of computers, as well as 2.5 million connections to the Wi-Fi. And the last measure, and I think this is a measure that, now that I have a couple of kids at home, hits me even more, is summer reading statistics. People love to know what's going on with kids. And even more than what's going on with kids, the fact that children are avoiding that summer slide by coming to summer reading programs. And let me just jump forward. If you look on the right, this comes from, I believe, a library system in Louisiana. And they talk about both the summer slide, they talk about how summer reading addresses educational student needs, and also how many kids it reaches, 40,000 kids. So highlighting that summer reading program as something that's a marquee program. Oh, and I apologize. That was actually the Huntsville, Madison County, Alabama library system that I borrowed that from. So, and then let's talk a little bit about qualitative benefits. So that same flyer for summer reading from Huntsville says, summer reading program offers substantive content to address students' educational needs, helps combat the summer slide. Now, there's actually peer-reviewed research backing up the efficacy of summer reading to combat learning loss. Dominican University did a study called Public Library Summer Reading Programs Close the Reading Gap. So the library is filling a crucial role in educating children. Another example that I think is more qualitative typically than quantitative is workforce training and helping people find jobs. There's a great story that I came across recently from a library out in California. The story was actually on the NPR radio show Marketplace. And it was a gentleman who came into the library, was using it regularly, was trying to do a job search, and a librarian came over to him and said, "Is there anything I can help you with?" And he sort of jokingly said, "I don't think you can unless you know something about job hunting." And she responded, "Oh, actually, I do." And then she showed this gentleman job search sites, how to use search terms for his area, which was behavioral analysis for autism. And he actually landed a job in the field because of her assistance. He had no idea in the interview, he says he had no idea that libraries were able to offer job guidance. Their jobs encompassed a lot more than I realized, Balcher said. And I think a lot of us, a lot of librarians have stories of helping someone learn how to use the internet or get a job. I think this is a great thing to talk about when you're talking about how libraries help folks learn. It's not just those kids, it's also people learning how to participate in the modern workforce. And finally, and this is really a basic point, but I think it's important to emphasize, an educated community, lifelong learning. At the grad school where I went to, University of Illinois, there was a wonderful quote that was etched into the building. The hope of democracy depends upon the diffusion of knowledge and wisdom. And I've taken that quote with me for 25 years now because I think there's really a lot of truth to it. And Andrew Carnegie, perhaps the greatest benefactor of libraries, said, "There's not such a cradle of democracy upon the earth as the free public library, this republic of letters, where neither rank, office, nor wealth receives the slightest consideration." All right, so library is institution of learning. Now let's switch over to the library as a community builder and a statistical area. Oh, let me start with a value statement, excuse me. Libraries add value as community builders by welcoming everyone to interact and engage. That's a general statement of the value that a library adds as a community builder. And I think programming statistics are really one of the quantitative ways that libraries can talk about this. I'm going to jump back again and just show you those Idaho Public Library programming statistics, 802,000, a 43% increase. In one number, you can see that they were doing a lot more programming in Idaho than they had done the previous year. Pretty impressive. Another quantitative statistic that I've seen a few studies about has to do with the value of real estate for a house in proximity to where a library is. So there was a 2010 study done looking at libraries in Philadelphia. It found that homes within a quarter mile of a library had property values about 10% higher than those further away. And I was curious if I could replicate this study with more modern real estate databases that we have. So I went for it. I performed a couple of Zillow searches. They were rather complex. I did this over the summer of 2024. And what I did was I looked at the newest 200 listings for residential listings for Zillow nationwide. And I calculated the mean and the median value for those. And then I looked at the newest 200 listings that specified public library as a phrase in the property description. And so for those listings that included public library, the median listing jumped from $430,000 nationwide to $510,000, or 18% higher than listings in general. So that's a quantitative way to show that libraries add value to their community just by being close to a library. To make sure that I wasn't crazy, I ran a couple other searches just to see, and the word beaches or beach also increased the property values quite a bit. Interestingly enough, zoo being listed actually decreased the property values, although I think it would be cool to live near a zoo, but apparently not everybody thinks that. So let's jump over to quantitative. Some of the values of having a library are to keep your main street vibrant, to keep things happening in the center of the community. I don't know about in Iowa, but in Vermont, we have lots of smaller communities, and those smaller communities, oftentimes the only real center of town is the school, the post office, sometimes the bank, and oftentimes the library. That's what there is. So in order to keep that community connected and together, the library oftentimes is what does that. A gathering spot in the same way as keeping that downtown, that main street vibrant, a place for people to come together. You may have read Eric Klinkenberg's Palaces for the People. It's a wonderful book about public spaces and how we need public spaces for people to come together. It also talks about that third point, the social well-being of residents. And I'm going to quote from that book briefly here to illustrate what I'm talking about. Increasingly, libraries big and small are positioning themselves to provide assistance to the less fortunate in the community by connecting patrons with the social services they may need. This has become a core function of the public library, and we would do well as a profession to emphasize it as a positive while supporting staff with what they need to accomplish the social mission safely and successfully. And Klinkenberg goes on to say, in a world where we spend even more of our time staring at screens, blocking out even our most intimate and proximate human contacts, public institutions with open door policies compel us to pay close attention to people nearby. Places like libraries are saturated with strangers, people whose bodies are different, whose style is different, who make different sounds, speak different languages, give off different, sometimes noxious smells. Spending time in public social infrastructures requires learning to deal with these differences in a civil manner. I think that that's a really powerful way to state that libraries help us all learn about each other. Libraries also help people with their own well-being. There was a study that was just released, I think it was this month, from the New York Public Library System. They partnered with the University of Pennsylvania's Positive Psychology Center to measure the effect of public libraries on patrons' social well-being. The resulting report noted that 92% of respondents reported feeling calm and peaceful after visiting the library. 90% of respondents said the library and its resources have a positive effect on how much they love to learn things, and 88% of respondents reported that library use has supported their personal growth. And one of the report's authors summed up the findings by saying, "I think libraries don't get the headlines they deserve. They're unsung bastions of goodwill in our world." Oh, Sam, I'm so excited that you read that study. One of the interesting follow-ups they want to do is they want to take it from the New York Public Library System to suburban and rural libraries. And I need to talk to our state librarian and see if that's something that we could take on. But I would love to be able to get that data replicated, and I think it would be not just in an urban library setting, but in a rural and a suburban library setting. So let's move on though. Keepers of history. This is something that I feel is a undervalued and undersold value of the public library as a place that really is increasingly where you can go to learn about your community. Not everything is online, and a lot of this stuff is definitely not online. So the value statement here is libraries add value as keepers of history by archiving and making accessible a community's historical record. And some of the measurements here are simple things like running the numbers. How many unique local history items does your library own? It's probably more than just a few, and you may be the only one or one of the few libraries that actually owns those items. It's hard to measure the value there. Programming statistics related to local history lectures, times that you have the Historical Society or partner with them, perhaps they're in your library. And then if you're keeping a digital archives, items that you've added to that digital archives. And then the more qualitative benefits there are how learning your local history fosters a sense of identity and continuity. So we had an exhibit, for example, at the library that I showed you that we opened, the new library in Shelburne, that examined the history of the women of Shelburne. This was something that was grant funded in celebration of the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. And it was an amazing display that the Historical Society and we partnered on. And it had all sorts of women, ranging from early Indigenous women to the first female governor of our state, who was actually at that ribbon cutting that you saw in the picture. So many people who had never been in the library came in just to see that exhibit. It really spoke to that sort of second point, which a community has many different groups, and all of those groups are important, but what connects it through a shared narrative is the history of that community, and the library oftentimes is the place where that happens. Yeah, I wonder too how many libraries have a museum or local history collection. We have a couple libraries here in Vermont, public libraries, that have amazing museums connected to them, and they're some of my favorite to visit. And so I think the more local history and the more fun things like that in your library, the better for everybody. All right, I'm going to jump to that fourth value. The library is a sustainable resource sharer. I don't know if you can really see the picture in the upper right-hand corner, but that's the community room of the library that I opened in Shelburne. It was a net zero building, and I'm really proud of the fact that it won the award as the best of the best building for our Efficiency Vermont organization. It was a really cool build. One of the things we had to do to make that happen was we had to put in electric fireplaces. So in that picture in the left-hand corner, there's an electric fireplace, which I was really hesitant to do. But the architects explained when you puncture through the exterior of a super insulated building, you're going to cause some problems in terms of keeping it net zero. So we put in the electric fireplaces, and actually were quite nice. A little weird to get used to, but they fit right in. They did a good job. Anyway, I'm getting off topic. So the value statement for the library is a sustainable resource sharer. Libraries add value as sustainable resource sharers by promoting resource sharing and fostering community resiliency. So I think that almost anywhere in the United States now, we are realizing that we need to be good stewards of the environment. We need to think about sustainability. We need to think about how our communities can bounce back from natural disasters that are increasing in frequency. And one of the ways that communities can and have been doing this for decades, actually 150 years, is having a library. So by sharing that space, sharing that community living room, you don't have to have maybe an extra room in your house and you can go a little smaller. By sharing the books that you have, you don't have to buy the books and have that tree cut down. And now we're sharing electronic books. You don't even have to have a paper book at all. Libraries have increasingly a library of things. We were talking before this meeting about a library in Iowa that has a ghost hunting kit. So instead of everybody having to go buy their own ghost hunting kit, they can just go and check that one out. Almost every library these days has a library of things. We have a program here in Vermont where a bunch of libraries have snowshoes, and I gotta be honest, I maybe go snowshoeing once every 2 years, but when I do, I don't have to keep them in my basement. I can just go to the library and check them out. Um, the paper and the trees for circulation. So there's lots of measurable benefits. There's probably even more than I've listed here. And then I want to talk a little bit about qualitative benefits. The library as a place for disaster recovery. So a couple years back, here in Vermont, we experienced once in a generation flooding. Our main library in Montpelier, and I actually will play some audio from the director there on a different topic shortly, but it was underwater completely. And 1 year later, in 2024, we had the same once in a generation flooding. 2 years in a row, two once in a generation floods, 2 years in a row. And what we found is for most of the libraries in affected communities, the libraries actually served as a place where people could come in and uh, have a place to cool off, have a place to file their paperwork with FEMA, have a place to meet, and have a place where they could kind of come in and get a building where they get to experience sort of a warm hug when they come in that building and see their neighbors and talk with them. So libraries increasingly are serving as places of refuge from natural disasters. Warming and cooling centers. All of our libraries in Vermont are listed on a state directory of places you can go and get in out of the heat, places you can come when it's below zero and warm yourself up. And then finally, library design, sustainable building design and retrofitting. Yeah, a tornado shelter during a tornado outbreak. Yep, that's a great example. So when we were designing our library in Shelburne, we said that we'd like to talk about the sustainability of the building. We'd like to talk about what elements we're going to have, and the architect said that's not even something we talk about as a separate topic anymore. That's something that is throughout the building design process. That's how important it is these days to think about. And the wonderful thing about having a library, for example, that has solar panels on the roof like ours did, was it wasn't just being sustainable, but we could take the dashboard from those solar panels and put it up on an LED monitor so kids and parents who came through could actually see the solar energy that was being produced and learn kind of the cycle of solar energy and how it worked and kind of become involved in that STEM aspect. So they could see what we were doing in the building as an example of what they might do. Or it was an educational opportunity. So that was a lot. But I'd like to talk a little bit about how you put all of this together and how you move it forward just from thinking about these values to creating an inventory and creating something hopefully that you'll be able to use in the evaluation process. So a value inventory allows you to speak to what matters to others. and to speak about what you believe in from an area that you feel passionately about. I don't think you can convince someone of something unless you genuinely believe it. So there's a wonderful library advocacy organization called Every Library. Patrick Sweeney, their director, gave a great talk at our Vermont Library Conference a few years ago. And one of the things he said is, if you're talking with people from one, political perspective, you should use the language they use. If you're talking with people from another political perspective, use the language and the ideas that they're interested in. And I get what he was saying, but I also think really, um, in order for people to be convinced about what you're saying, you have to really feel passionately about it yourself. And so I think putting together a values inventory is a way to take what you've seen in the library and kind of personalize it for what's most important for you. So it gives you that framework to share your love of the library. And it gets you kind of thinking outside of perhaps your box to look at all of those values, at least those 4 values. And I want to give you a concrete example of that. I had mentioned the Kellogg Hubbard Library a little bit earlier. That's our state capital, Montpelier's public library. It's beautiful. And their director was interviewed a couple months ago on our statewide public radio. And I want to play about 3 or 4 minutes of her interview because I think Carolyn did a wonderful job of talking about the values she sees in her library and expressing those in a way that sort of speaks to this. So let me play this for you.
Vermont libraries recently received their largest infusion of federal money in decades. 14 public libraries will split nearly $16 million in grants. They will fund infrastructure upgrades in a state where half of library buildings are more than 100 years old. But today's libraries offer a lot more than books. Recently, reporter Erica Heilman stopped at the Kellogg Hubbard Library in Montpelier to learn about the role that libraries play in communities.
This is the sound of the children's section of the Kellogg Hubbard Public Library in Montpelier at 3:15 on a Thursday. This month alone in a Vermont public library, you could attend a banjo meetup, an advanced beginners Italian conversation club, or a paranormal investigation of the Fox Room at the Rutland Free Library. You could also spend the whole day at your library reading about snakes, and no one's going to ask you for money or ask why you're there or when you'll leave. And for some reason, these days, this seems positively subversive. I talked with Carolyn Pacazio, the Kellogg Hubbard Library Director of Library Services. I asked her, who comes here? What followed was the following.
We have grandparents or parents, new parents often coming in for story time. We have people who are working remotely, who don't have a co-working space or maybe live in a tiny apartment. We have someone who lives in a group home who needs support, that they're not able to live on their own, and they come in multiple times a day to use our public computer. So that person is sitting on our public computer with headphones on, like jamming out to music videos on YouTube. We have library donors who have lived in the community forever, who are now volunteers, who are coming in to pick up books to take with them to the local daycare and offer story time surrounded by little children out in one of our member towns. We have folks who are
She goes on actually for quite some time talking about all of the various types of patrons. And I just want you to think about sort of her knowledge of the way that those values, the various values of the library, inform her advocacy. Caroline's a very strong advocate, but also a well-spoken advocate, because I think she really thinks about all of the different ways her library is used. And so that's just one example of how you might use such an inventory. We have about 15 minutes
Vermont
left.
libraries recently.
So I want to get into a very keep it simple, silly method for how you might go about analyzing your library in terms of the values that it may have. And I know that Sam's going to make this presentation available, so perhaps you could even print this one out and go ahead and do sort of a thought exercise for half an hour or so, or a group exercise with you and some of the fellow trustees to think about for your own library what sort of measurable and then what sort of qualitative benefits it has for these different areas as an institution of learning, a community builder, a keeper of history, a sustainable resource share. So this is just a very simple method to kind of create your own inventory. Now I want to talk about extending this idea of creating an inventory of your library values to taking that to evaluation. I know you've had some great talks about evaluation. This is an underwhelming beginner novice approach, but I think an inventory of values can really serve as a baseline for um, for an evaluation, because once you have that inventory, you can track it to see what changes there may be. Evaluation, of course, is an iterative process. You evaluate based on the changes from a starting point to an ending point. And I also think it's important to think of um, when you evaluate qualitative measures or things that are really hard to put into numbers, it's really a long game strategy. It can take years, perhaps decades, to see meaningful, actionable results from the work of evaluating how your library is serving as a community builder. That's not going to happen overnight or even in a year or even in the stretch of 1, 3, or 5 year strategic plan. But if you focus on it and you pay attention to it, it will happen eventually. I want to briefly talk about some other values a library might have. So technology. Technology, just like when you build a building, the sustainability aspects run throughout. Technology really runs throughout almost everything we do in libraries, from ebooks as part of what we do for an institution of learning to helping people apply for benefits as something that's community building, to digitizing historical resources. I didn't include tech as a separate topic because it really is sort of interwoven in everything that a library is doing these days. I also didn't include expanding horizons or serving as kind of a bastion of intellectual freedom. Um, but I do want to mention this as a possible additional area where you might do a values inventory. I love the basic idea that a library provides, and this comes from Rudine Sims Bishop, windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors. So when we read a book, she was focused on children's books, but I think this is true of all of our resources. We can get a window into the reality of others. We can learn something about ourselves. And that sliding glass door concept relates to how readers can walk into a story and become part of a world created by an author. You can be fully immersed in another experience. So I don't like to focus on intellectual freedom too much, but I do like to think about how libraries both will enhance our understanding of ourselves and also people who are different than us. Um, and finally, cost benefit analysis. I wouldn't throw it out the door. I've used it myself. Libraries are money savers. I don't think it's a bad thing to say. I just think it's the idea of this talk is to talk about some of those other things. And I'm curious if you all have any others that have come to mind that weren't necessarily on this list. Something to think about because I'm sure that I've missed some. Um, so if there's any that you can think of that you've thought of that I left off, please feel free to drop it in the chat, or I would love it if you would drop me an email. And that is the end of my presentation. I've really appreciated our time together. I'm happy to take a few questions if there are any questions that are out there, or I'm also happy to take them via email. You're welcome to send me a follow-up email, and I will for sure answer.
Well, thank you so much, Kevin. I can tell you that there are plenty of keepers of history in our listening audience tonight because many people chimed in to talk about their local history collections and the partnerships they have with their local genealogy societies. So I thought that was very cool. That resonated with many tonight. I will just say that I think there still today persists some real stereotypes about public libraries. Libraries in general, I suppose, but certainly about public libraries, you know. There are so many stereotypes out there that we still need to bust through. And so I think you've given us such thoughtful ideas to help us talk about the library's value in fresh ways, in surprising ways, because I would love to see some of this storytelling become surprising to the people that we're talking to, you know, to the funders at the city and county and state level who would probably not altogether know all of the wide variety of things that libraries do in 2025.
That's such a good point. And really, like having that 30-second elevator speech be informed by this that's really the point. Or your budget presentation when you go
Yeah.
before the decision makers. So having some of those surprising stories about what we do really around people as much as resources.
We had such an interesting our lunch keynote was really quantitative focus, places to get data
Yes.
sources to pursue and that sort of thing. But Jess also mentioned in that presentation that the data is really a piece of data can be really powerful when it's paired with a story. So, and I think that's where some of what you're describing, Kevin, comes in, where it's like, all right, so it's not just that we served 300 meals this summer, but here's the story of kids and teens that were impacted by what we did with that. But
That is so true. And I love that piece about pairing data with the story. That's probably the most powerful because then you're really speaking to people who are either, data wonks or people who love a good story. If you do both of those, you're hitting both of those groups and making, reinforcing the point. That's such a wise point.
well, and I mean, the title of your talk, Beyond Return on Investment, I think dollars do speak in really big ways, but it's also just so nice to be able to put a human element with some of that to say, these are the people that's lives were changed because of what the library did. So I'm always really encouraged to be thinking more about that. I think my natural inclination is a little more towards the data side. Although Bonnie knows I do go a little bit nuts for making numbers count is
One of
a
our favorite books, Kevin, you shared with us some of your favorite books, and here's one of ours, Making Numbers Count.
Mhm.
We have a book discussion that we do that we sponsor at the state library about 4 times a year, and that's one of the books we read a couple of years ago. And Sam became kind of disturbingly enamored of
unabashedly enthusiastic.
unabashedly. But it's such a good book about just that very thing that Sam has said is taking the numbers that we collect because it's so routine to collect them, but presenting them in surprising ways, presenting them in ways that people can better relate to rather than just raw numbers or bullet points on a piece of paper.
Oh,
So,
I love a good infographic. There's nothing better
yay.
than a good. I don't care what it's about. I was at
You're here for it.
I was at Disney World not too long ago, and we were at Animal Kingdom at this like thing off to the side where they take care of the animals, and there was an infographic about veterinarians, and I spent about five. My daughter had to pull me away from it. It was just so well done.
Okay,
So I hear
I
you.
got your next coffee table book coming to you in the chat.
Oh,
It's a whole big, humongous book of infographics. You got to check it
oh,
out.
all
Maybe you've
right.
already seen
Um,
it.
I will for
Um,
sure check it out.
the
she
other
needs
thing
a
I want,
hobby.
she
Kevin,
needs a,
I'm just saying she needs a hobby.
she does. Um, but what I also want to just encourage, I know we have so many small libraries in the chat or in the room tonight too, and I think we can get a little dismayed when it comes to small libraries and numbers because we tend to think, I circulated X number of books, but when you look at that big town up the road, they circulated so many more. But when you can really prove the unique value that your institution provides in your town, whatever that is, that's when you're really going to have a lot of buy-in is again just a really sort of technical commercial type of word, but you're going to really have a lot of investment from your community, whatever that looks like for you. So putting your thumb on that unique value um, outside of numbers is important no matter what size town you're
Yeah,
in or
I
what
think
size community you serve.
I've worked with librarians here. We have a consultant that really focuses on small and rural libraries because they're a unique and special part of our library landscape in Vermont and also in Iowa. And sometimes you'll only have a handful of patrons in one day, but those patrons are the library was what they were planning to do that day, and it made the difference for them. And typically, you have those days, then you have the days where the kids come in for story time when you're open for a few hours on the weekend, and it just becomes this amazing experience for the entire community. And so, trying to think about those times when you can kind of document that value. Maybe if you're having a moment in the library, thinking about why that moment is special and then writing it down and then trying to work from that, I think either towards a story or thinking about sort of how can we make this happen more often is a really a smart way to go for any size library. I love smaller libraries.
Yes.
They are the lifeblood really of many of our communities here.
Yeah, Judy points out sometimes the librarian, the only person that a patron might talk to that day. And that's a hard thing to quantify, but it's a beautiful um, it's a just a beautiful picture of what some of that community building. um, I have a little gig that I do sometimes called that I've subtitled like using your library facility in the fight against the epidemic of loneliness, like how we use our library facilities to encourage people to connect with one another and build stronger communities and the role that that can play. So very, very good. Bonnie, any closing thoughts from you?
No, I don't believe so. I'd just like to thank you again, Kevin, for joining us for this evening presentation. I thought it was wonderful. And to all of you in the listening audience for spending your evening this way, we thank you so very much for supporting our efforts at the State Library in continuing education and for spending your evening with us at ILOC 2025. It's been a good day,
Oops.
huh?
I had copied the evaluation link and then I got excited about the infographic book and I just put the infographic book back in. Here we go. So we do want to evaluate our conference on evaluation. So please do fill out the form that I did now get the right link in for. But we want to hear from you folks, and that will be the same venue for earning your CE credit. If you've got your Workday Learning account set up and you want to see credit hours tracked, please be sure to grab that form, fill it out, and we'll count up the sessions you attended and make sure the hours are reflected there. So we are very thankful to our many trustees who are in this audience. We are so grateful to you for your service to Iowa Libraries. We could not work the way that we do without all of you. So thank you. Keep up the good fight. And many thanks to Kevin for coming in from Vermont this evening, hanging up the snowshoes for a hot minute to spend a night on Zoom with us. So thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Bonnie. And thank you all for coming. Have a great rest of your evening. Bye-bye.